Thanks. Who is ready for a fun afternoon of compliance discussions? So we're here to talk to you about assessing the maturity of information security programs. And thanks for the intros. So again, I'm David in information security since about 2000, and I have a computer science degree, but find myself in a position where I also find compliance topics pretty interesting.
And I'm Jaffa. A little bit about me. I've worked in large and small enterprise security organizations, but really my expertise is within security, compliance, risk, as well as internal audit, which is why I'm not scared to say that I enjoy a good audit. I'm one of those weird people, so enjoy compliance. So let's get started. So we'll take a quick look at the agenda. So in case you just stumbled in here and don't realize why you're here, the goal of our talk today is to provide you a solution with how to measure maturity within your information security program. So how we're going to do that is first we're going to look at the problem, what we're really looking to solve, what are the core questions. We'll look at define some key terminology. Then we'll look at some available solutions for maturity models as well as security frameworks that we considered in developing our solution. Then we'll dive actually into what we created and just wrap up with some conclusions. So like I said, let's start with the problem. So as many of you know, you work in security. There's constantly new threats, new vulnerabilities, new compliance requirements, as well as just figuring out ways to do things better. So to address that, you're going to continuously improve your security program through things like implementing new tools, implementing new controls, tweaking policies, automation, patching. All these things are going to impact your overall security program. So David and I, we used to work together, and we found ourselves in a situation where we were drastically improving our security program through all those projects that we mentioned. As though we felt like we were doing a great job, really the question became is how good are we at security? What type of metrics can we create to tell how good we are at security? And then how can we quantify the progress? So we're doing all these big projects. How can we show that we're progressing toward a mature security program? And then when you look at a security program holistically, within the controls, how can you specifically identify your gaps? And then finally, how can you communicate out to the business? So those are the core questions that we're looking to solve. But before we get into how we solved it, we just want to set a baseline with some of the key definitions and terms that we looked at. So these are not new terms. I'm sure you've all heard of compliance, risk, and maturity, but there is a lot of different definitions out there of how to define what these are. So I'll caveat that these are how we define them to make most sense to us within the solution. So compliance, that's the easy one. That's the one everyone loves. So it's adherence to all the security laws, the regulations, the benchmarks, the standards, all this stuff we're trying to avoid, but we have to do. Things like PCI or HIPAA or GDPR. So then there's compliance, and then we look at risk. So the risk definition that we thought was most appropriate is from this SB 853. They do a much better job explaining it than I can, so I'm just going to read what their definition is. It's a measure of the extent to which an entity is threatened by a potential circumstance or event. So typically, you're measuring that by either the impact as well as the likelihood. So we're not going to talk a lot about a risk management program, but what's important here is to understand the relationship between risk and between maturity. So typically within organizations, you have a risk management program. You're measuring your risk from a low impact risk or to a critical risk. Hopefully for any critical highs, you're going to want to put a mitigation plan in place to reduce that risk. So that's when maturity comes in. So for maturity, we're looking at a measure of the quality of the control that you've implemented for that desired control. So you pick a control to help reduce that risk, and now we're looking at how quality is that control. So there's different maturity models that you can look at to do that, and typically they're within these 5 different sections, things like policy or integration. We'll get into what that means a little bit later in the presentation, but to further drive the point, David's going to provide an example of what risk versus maturity means.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious who in the room is more involved with like managing a security program or on the compliance side of sites. A couple of you, and then are there a lot of application security folks here at LASCON? Good deal. So, and who actually does like risk assessments and risk management using some sort of like more or less formal methodology? Okay, so there's different methodologies, right? You have like quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. But I really wanted to dwell a little bit more on how do maturity of controls and risk interact with each other, because they're not the same thing, and I think it's pretty important to understand that. So I have an example here. Let's look at a risk assessment saying, oh, the scenario is basically unauthorized network traffic might traverse my company network's edge between the internet and the internal network. So if I don't mitigate this risk at all, that's a pretty high risk. I might express it in like qualitatively, or maybe I'm able to express it quantitatively. Doesn't matter for our case. I put a number on there. It's like, annually I might lose, I don't know, $1 million because of threats that traverse that boundary between the internet and the internal network. So what do I want to do about this? Pretty typically, I'd put in a firewall, right? Segment my internal networks from the external internet. And I put two options in here. I said, okay, so one option for a firewall is we'll put a firewall at the edge. All incoming traffic from the internet is blocked. All outgoing traffic from our networks is allowed. And that sits there and does its job, and we expect it to mitigate this risk. There's another option that takes that further and says, we're going to implement this firewall, but we're also going to block outbound traffic. We're going to look at the actual traffic that's being blocked, look at whether it might indicate like indicators of compromise internally in the network. And we're going to look at metrics and see whether we can improve our firewall rules based on those, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you guys think? Like, which of these two options is more mature? Yeah, I would agree. So pretty simple. We put it in place. It sits there. We don't maintain it going forward. It just sits there. And then option two, we continuously evaluate how it's working and iterate on improving the configurations. We keep it patched. And so you'd think that probably if I can rely more on this control that I'm putting in place, at the end of the day, my risk is going to be lower than if I put a control in place but really don't take care of it and maintain it. So going forward from there, what did we actually come up with to look at maturity of our controls? There's a lot of standards out there. Those of you in the compliance world know a lot of these acronyms. There's both frameworks that give you lists of controls, security controls to implement that you can use as your baseline. And there's also standards that deal specifically with how do I express maturity of programs, may they be security related or not. And then there's a couple standards that do both. COBIT gives you sets of controls, but also a way to manage maturity. HITRUST has that built in to some extent. This is a thing called NIST Prisma. And so what we settled on is we basically determined, well, none of these overlapping frameworks out there meet what we want to do. So we're going to take the NIST cybersecurity framework. Who here is familiar with that? Great, okay. And we're going to take NIST's Prisma standard. Anybody heard of that? Kind of what I expected. Prisma stands for Program Review for Information Security Assurance. And while it comes with its own sort of like control objectives and lists of topics to review, it also has a maturity model built in. So we decided to combine the controls from the cybersecurity framework with the Prisma maturity approach.
So So it's great. A lot of you already raised your hand, so you must be familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework. But if you're not, here is a snapshot of what that looks like. It's a fairly new framework. It was established in 2014 to help implement the security executive order. The way that it breaks down security is into 5 core functions. It looks at identity, protection, detection, response, and then recovery. It also breaks down into categories and then further into subcategories. The reason I chose this particular framework is, one, we felt like the functions and categories are really easy to visualize and communicate to not just security professionals, but really anybody within the business. We also felt like the categories were generic enough to be able to map to any of those other common controls. Other common control frameworks like ISO or HITRUST or PCI, all those other things that you have to comply with, we're able to map that into this cybersecurity framework and consider that in our evaluation. Thirdly is the emphasis on responding and recovery. A lot of cybersecurity frameworks out there don't look at that. It's just a piece of the framework, and that was important to us as an organization. So this is the NIST cybersecurity framework. As we mentioned, we use this as the core baseline, and then we adopted the maturity model. So in the next slide, you'll see what that looks like. So here's a baseline of what that looks like. So as David had mentioned, the NIST Prisma model does have its own baseline as well, but we kind of dropped that because we felt like the NIST cybersecurity framework was more robust. So we took that and then we just added on to the maturity model. So this is the Prisma maturity model, and it looks at it maturity within these 5 different areas. So when we were going through and evaluating controls, how we evaluated the controls was, first we said, does this control have a policy in place, an approved policy in place? Is there a detailed procedure that says how can we execute on that policy? How well has it been implemented across the organization? Is it everywhere? Is it actually being used? How can we test that for its effectiveness? And then finally, integration, can we optimize on that control and continuously improve on that? So those are the 5 core sections that we looked at. And in the next slide, this is actually putting data into that and reviewing our calculations. So this is our solution. Surprise, it's a massive Excel sheet. All you compliance people can love that. Appreciate that. But really what it is, so this is the cybersecurity framework here. What we did is zoom into the particular identity so we could show exactly how we did those calculations. So just to break it down further, we have our functions. Those are the kind of the highest baseline. Then we look at category, and then we look at subcategory. And subcategory is where we really start to evaluate maturity. So at a subcategory level, we look at, again, what I just went through in the Prisma model around policy, procedure, implementation. And with those scoring, we'll talk about how that scoring works in just a minute. But with that scoring, we come up with our maturity model, or maturity score. So a couple things to point out with the maturity, we also set a goal for each of these subcategories. The reason why that's important is because for some of these categories, you may not want a 5 maturity. You may not want to test it. It really just depends on your organization and what's important and critical to you. So you want to set that goal for each of them. And then finally, we set a priority. How important is this to us? And how important of a risk is it to us as well? And that's important because as we go through and we see these deficits between maturity, that's where we can better prioritize which projects we want to tackle. So David's going to talk a little bit more about how the calculations work and some examples of how it's used.
Yeah, so let's look at a couple examples on this spreadsheet. So again, we dove into one of the cybersecurity framework functions, broken down into categories and subcategories. And then for each subcategory, we look at, do we have a policy that defines the control objectives for this category? Do we have a procedure in place? Is it implemented fully? And then once it's implemented, do we have metrics? Are we testing it? Are we making sure it's effective? And then lastly, do we go back and based on these metrics and testing, do we improve upon what we're doing? And so one thing to point out here is that we have these 5 areas: policy, procedure, implementation, testing, and integration. And basically, depending on whether you meet all of these, you end up with a maturity score for your category that's between 0 and 5. 5 fully mature, you continuously improve upon what you have. So a couple of things that are interesting. in this approach to measuring maturity that we chose, when we look at the yellow pieces here as examples, we say for subcategory ID BE2, we have an implementation in place. It may not be perfect, but we're doing something. Yet, because we don't have a policy and because we don't have any procedures in place, this implementation doesn't count at all towards maturity. The overall maturity rating is still 0. So basically the point here being these maturity levels are hierarchical. If you don't have a policy, if you don't have your control objectives defined that you want to manage toward, then you can't determine whether your implementation applies at all to what we're trying to manage against, so it doesn't count. Another thing I wanted to point out is the green highlighting up here. Basically for our subcategory ID AM3, are we mapping data flows in the organization? We have a policy in place. We need to do this. We're supposed to do this. There's an objective to do this, but we're not doing it. We don't have any procedures. It's not implemented. And yet, even though we have these 5 maturity levels, we get a 1 1/4, a 1.25 as a maturity grade. And the reason that is that we're biased toward these first 3 maturity levels. It's more important that we have policies and procedures and an implementation. And then, whether you're testing and integrating or not, you get less points for that. So it puts a bias on, okay, let's put this in place, let's operate it. And then once we get to a state where we start improving and measuring, that's icing on the cake in some way, if you will. So yeah, question?
What's your priority column for?
Good question. I will show you that on the next slide, because now the question is, what do we actually do with this? So, there's some compliance wonks sitting there working on this spreadsheet and assigning maturity ratings, but then what we really want to do is report on the maturity of our controls and then our overall program, right? So you can do things like break it down into the cybersecurity framework categories that you see here. And you can say, Jaffa, you talked earlier about what's our goal? We don't want to be perfect at everything we do. We need to dedicate our resources to what's most important. So for some controls, we may want to be close to perfect. Others are not important enough for us in terms of mitigating risk that we need to operate them at full maturity levels. So in blue, you can see we have goals defined. And then the orange here says, where are we actually compared to our goal with the maturity in these control areas? And then what you can do with the priorities is you can look at the gaps you have for a given control or category, or however you break it down, and say, well, certain gaps are more important, have higher priority for us to mitigate than others. And so that informs your upcoming initiatives, basically.
How much money you spend to make the change?
Exactly. And so then what else can we do, Jaffa?
So here's another example of a report. I call this kind of the executive level report. So this is looking at it at the highest level. I'm looking at it from identify, protect, those 5 different functions. And it looks at it over a year of time, of how are you progressing in each of these function areas. So this is important because let's say your executives or your business are saying, hey, we need to be better at identifying your assets. In this chart, you can show how we're doing better. Of course, if you're looking at it from this hierarchical level, you're going to miss some of these details. So you want to be prepared to be able to dive down deep and to look at what the details are. Where are you missing policies? Where are you missing procedures? But having this kind of bar graph is able to understand and look at where you're at from a progression level within the 5 functions. Okay.
So, I was just wondering, can we adapt this to just say a subset of, say, application security program, dealing with just say product security engineering? Because that's my kind of, I'm kind of seeing if there's any
Yeah.
experience, because this is generally covers the whole lot, where I'm not really interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this morning, we were sitting here and thinking, like, oh, we're at an application security conference. Like, So really, if you look at it with that lens, then typically you'd expect to have certain like security controls built into your software development life cycles, right? Do we do code reviews? Are we training our developers? How do we do testing? What kind of testing do we do? Do we do threat modeling? And so there's frameworks that give you lists of controls that you would want to build into your SDLC. And so what you could easily do is, instead of using this cybersecurity framework as the catalog for your controls, you just take either your homegrown or like a standardized framework for the security elements of an SDLC, and then you start measuring against those in your maturity. Does that make sense? Yes. Yep. Right. So one thing that we wanted to talk a little bit more is we looked at the spreadsheet, and so, okay, we're mapping maturity against the cybersecurity framework, functions and categories and subcategories. But really, depending on where you are in your company with managing compliance, maybe you don't do any of this right now. And so just mapping against the cybersecurity framework is a good start, because we talked earlier about it's fairly straightforward, it's fairly generic, it's easy to talk to executives about. It breaks it down into these 5 functions. But really, if you are living in a more complex environment in terms of compliance requirements, typically what happens is, just to take this as an example here, you may have like the cybersecurity framework says, oh, you need to manage your physical assets. But then what that translates to is somewhere in your company, you have a common control set or whatever it may be called, a policy that defines how you actually need to do asset management. And it's more likely that there are more details in here than what the cybersecurity framework tells you. And then if you're in an organization that has multiple compliance requirements, then this common control set may be based on like a whole bunch of standards you're managing against, right? So there might be, first and foremost, if you do risk assessments, then you have mitigating controls that are defined in your, as a result of your risk assessments. So those go into this common control set. Just these examples, you might be managing against ISO 27001 as a baseline. So the requirements from that standard go into your common control set. And you might be managing against FISMA and the requirements in Special Publication 853. And so the requirements for asset management in FISMA also go into your common control set. And from there then, what we are doing in the presentation you earlier saw of results and whatnot, we simplify that into the language of the cybersecurity framework, just as a way to have a straightforward way to talk about where we are. On the flip side, what that means is that if you are the one who is actually going and assigning maturity ratings to these CSF controls, you need to keep in mind what your common control set is. So, you know, CSF may be very simple, the requirement in there, but then behind that stands this whole policy. So when you are saying, do we have a policy for everything we need to do, then you need to take all of these things into account. Does that make sense? Okay. Good deal. So, conclusions.
Cool, so I want to bring it back to the problem that I talked about and these problems that we were going to solve, and just talk about how we solve them with this solution. So obviously we have a ton of data now around our controls, around our control quality. So we're able to solve and make metrics for some of these. So how good are we at security? I think the best example is the one David showed. We were able to show, here's our goal against what our current average is. We looked at how can we quantify progress. So that's, as you saw in the other report, you can quantify progress by just looking at the metrics and seeing how it goes over time. to show if there's a specific project, let's say we're doing a big project like a SIM implementation, you're going to show the progress within that metrics because you're going to see an increase, an automatic increase within that. So how do we identify gaps in control quality? So we're able to do that because we're actually looking at it and breaking it down between the maturity model. We can actually look at, do we have a policy in place and that's breaking down the quality, or is it not being implemented? We just have the policy. So we're able to look at it from a granular perspective to understand what the quality of that control is. And then finally, like I mentioned before, we have a ton of data, so you can break it up as you like, be able to develop different reports, different metrics, something specific just as from a data perspective, but you can also look at it from a specific control perspective as well. So you would have a lot of more flexible and freedom to have to use that data to communicate that to the business.
Cool. And then finally, well, because all of you are excited to go and do something like this on your own now, right? We wanted to point out a couple of things to keep in mind that we sort of experienced and thought about while we put this in place. First thing, we talked about this early in the beginning, don't confuse maturity with risk. So in all likelihood, if you stand in front of whoever your audience is, maybe your executives, and say, once our firewalls are at a maturity level of 5 and we like keep improving on how they work all the time, our risk is going to be 0. Probably not true. The firewall might be as effective as you can get it, but there's still risk that somebody circumvents it or manipulates it. So risk and maturity are not the same, and you need to be careful about how you express that to your audience. Then maturity ratings are only as objective as your humans are. So this is not a quantitative approach unless you get really good at having like useful metrics for all of your controls that you're trying to look at. There is still like subject matter experts like Jaffa and I who sit there and say, oh, we have all the policies that we need for this control. We think, yes, we're going to give ourselves a 1. And then we're going to look at procedures. And we're like, well, do our like technology teams have procedures that implement these policies properly? And we look around and we'd say like, yeah, maybe a 1 or maybe mostly 0.5. And then we look at implementation and we start like digging into like how this is actually implemented, how do we measure effectiveness, etc. And at the end of the day, it's still us just assigning a more or less subjective rating on what we think where we are, right? So this is not quantitative measurements, if you will. Another thing to think about, a control that has a high maturity level may still not be effective in what it's supposed to do. And where that can happen is if you have a control objective that's not clear enough about what exactly needs to happen so that you mitigate your risk in a certain area, you might just have a very vague objective that says, let's put a firewall in place. Let's not talk about whether it should be stateful or stateless, or whether it should be application aware, and whether it should have a built-in IDS or IPS. It just says firewall. The teams who implement the policy may have a perfect procedure to implement a simple firewall, and they might be managing it well. And yet, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely effective in mitigating the risk that your risk assessment team had in mind when they said, oh, if we put a firewall in place, this is going to mitigate our risk by X. And the last thing on here, sort of obvious, but maybe not. Scope changes may screw with your baselines. So if you add a completely new environment, maybe you acquire a company or whatever, you add a new environment that's now being subject to your security program, then that may be less or more mature than your previous environments that you were managing. And so that may mess with your maturity levels and measurements. So if you're doing like trending and somebody says, oh, why is our maturity going down here instead of up? Maybe it's because you added a new environment and it's less mature, those kind of things. Does that mean you need to track maturity of your control objectives for individual environments individually or not, that's something you got to figure out. And really our last slide here answers your question from earlier again. We're at LASCON, so application security, what's up? And basically, yeah, we talked about it. BSIM is, if you're not familiar with BSIM, it's a great way of looking at the secure elements in software development life cycles across different industries and what's more common and what not, and how do you level up against that. With that being said, any questions, comments?
One question. So if you have something that's like a general control that may influence another set of controls in another area, and maybe that general control is just not very mature. So something like security awareness and training might impact some incident response type of procedures or response. Is that something that's taken into account, or do those kind of stand alone, stand independently when you're reviewing them for maturity?
Good question. So the question is, when controls, may they be more generic or not, they may be impacting how other controls work and how effective those are. Depends. I would say it really depends on how you manage that, and like how you look at taking the results of looking at your maturity back to your risk management program. So I'll have a black and white answer, but it's definitely a good question to think about.
Okay.
Yes, you mentioned rolling up other compliance frameworks under NIST CSF. So you had ISO, IEC, and some others.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had any difficulty squeezing that round peg into a square hole, or saw any gaps, or what you said?
Yes. It's, you could even argue that, like, well, if the NIST cybersecurity framework isn't one that your company has declared it wants or needs to be compliant with, why are you adding just yet another layer of a controls framework onto that? And so it depends. Like, you could easily, like, if you say ISO 27001 is the baseline for my company, you could use the controls from the NXA controls and the mandatory controls and use that and then map maturity against that. For us, the reason why we chose the cybersecurity framework was, it's been pretty popular with, across industries. So it's easy to talk about it in different, like verticals. It's freely available. NIST maintains it.
I think it also goes back to having that subject expertise. Like David and I deeply understood all our controls and all the different frameworks as well. So we put that into consideration, even though it didn't nicely map into there as well. We were able to kind of think about that as we rated our maturity.
So you guys were able to massage it in there, the ISO, where the...
Yeah, everything was able to fit within there. There's always a subcategory that's going to map back. It just depends on kind of the specific standards that you adhere to.
Cool. Anything else?
One last question, sorry. Kind of in your experience in using this model, the two combined NIST tools there, what has been any sort of like response from the recipients of that information? So for any prioritization or business decisions that have to be made from that, is that something that in your experience that kind of looked at and said, oh, this is a great metric, this really paints a new light on how mature this control is, or does it tend to be more like, it's just a number, we're doing all right?
Good question. I think it really depends on your organization. It's definitely, it works as having talking points and something to talk to. But then, if you look at, hey, we're really bad at this function or this control, and here's where we are with our maturity, you still, again, got to put it into the perspective, okay, what does that mean in terms of the risk we are incurring? And then it really depends on, the story you build around, like, what these numbers tell you.
I also think that using NIST cybersecurity framework, bringing it to the audience, you're able to show the holistic security program. You're not just focusing on application security. You're just not just focused on asset management. Be able to show people that don't really realize that there's an entire program involved, and be able to show a metric for that and break that down as well. And I think that's a good use case for that as well.